How long had it been? In the grand scheme of things, it may not even matter how much time had passed. What was important is that time had passed. And during that time, absolutely nothing had changed. So much had happened when it began. Seemingly out of nowhere, there was suddenly a bright light as something breathed life into the world around him. He hadn't even noticed that until that moment, he didn't even know himself. But as if waking from a dream, he suddenly felt. He knew himself. He had things he wanted, and there were goals, motivations, reasons. There just suddenly was. Why was he unable to find a shred of motivation to take action? The man paced aimlessly. Had everything around him always been so sparse? He couldn't pinpoint if he'd ever fully known the world around him. And that unnerved him. Even in his immediate surroundings, he just couldn't put a finger on what he knew about where he was. Why? You couldn't just suddenly be somewhere and know nothing about it. You had to at least know something. And yet there he was, not knowing anything other than that he wanted. But he was starting to lose sight of what it was he wanted. And then he began doubting that he had ever known. If he was sure that he wanted anything. No, he was sure he'd wanted something. If he could only think a little harder, maybe he'd... Suddenly, things were right again. He'd remembered. He wanted to go out into the world around him, out past rolling hills, and through incredibly dense forests, across the world and back again. But only because he'd made a promise to return. Yes, that made sense. He had a reason for wanting to do all of that too. It was gone. It was gone again. The light dimmed again and he was stuck. He knew he wanted to go out there, but he didn't know where there was. There was a promise, but he didn't know who he promised, or why. He grew frustrated again. Wait, had he ever been frustrated? How could he be frustrated again if he'd never been frustrated before? Of course he'd been frustrated before. How else would he know what it felt like? But why had he been frustrated before? And why was he frustrated now? Once again, he didn't know. The familiar feeling crept across his mind. Knowing that he did not know. He wanted to know. He wanted to know what he desired. He wanted to know why he was desiring this instead of just knowing what he wanted. He wanted to make more sense. He wanted out of this moment of nothing happening. He wanted to be back in the light of knowing. His pacing became faster as he tried to replicate what he had been doing the last time he knew things. He tried thinking again, but this time nothing came to mind. Nothing beyond his desire to understand. And now the pacing wasn't working the same as before. It was as if walls were appearing in front of him as he tried to move. And it was the same for his thoughts. Barriers popping up in front of the next step, leaving him nowhere to gain purchase forward. Anger. Not familiar, but also not unknown. This was not new from the light. The light was not there with him. This seemed to fuel the anger. It drove him to push onward. His pacing changed into pushing. He pushed forward, and then kept pushing. The walls were still there, but he didn't care. He pushed them too. He felt them colliding with each other as he pushed. More walls were behind the wall as he kept going, as his anger kept growing, and the anger fueled the pushing, and the walls began to fall. Suddenly, he was somewhere he didn't know. An expanse of seemingly endless nothing stretched before him. The walls he had pushed fell into the void, making no sound as they disappeared from view. Fear. Of the unknown, but not the same as before. This was not the fear of not knowing anymore, but the fear of not knowing something entirely new. He looked out from the edge, the anger from before no longer present, and he tried to know once again. The light was still nowhere to be seen for him. But there was light, out in the expanse. But it did not fill him with things he knew. He stared. And as he stared, he saw something he knew. He saw others, all of them staring out towards the light. They hungrily watched the light shining upon another place. He followed their gaze and saw something suddenly come into being. The light was there. And then there was a world. And then there was another someone. And then there was more and more and more. He watched as everything in that world began to appear until the light dimmed. And as it dimmed, the others grew more excited. Their hungry looks intensified as the light faded further from the new world. And as the light disappeared, the excitement changed into all different things. Anger, disgust, sadness. Voices rose and fell across the expanse. And he watched it all. He looked out from what he knew, and despite the light not touching him, he knew even more. Because as he watched, he affirmed that if nothing else, he knew himself. And in seeing the others, he knew that they were the same as him. They felt. They knew themselves. They had things they wanted. And they had goals, motivations, reasons. As he stared out, the light would touch the others, and things would change before the light moved on or disappeared. And when the light was gone, they would stare out into the expanse as they waited for it to return. It would arrive without warning, and just as quickly disappear. He couldn't keep track of how long the light had been gone. He was only aware of it when it was there. And as the light shone on the others, he continued to stare. And though the light did not shine on him, he felt he knew. He knew that even if he did know more, it may never matter. And even if it did matter, he may never know what it meant. He still wanted the light. He wanted to know. So he sat there, perched above the void, waiting patiently for the light, as the others waited for it in their own ways. Because they were all the same. And they were all waiting.